On May 14, 1852, every newspaper in New Orleans reported the same auction. A young man, barely 23, sold for a price that shattered records across the entire South. They called him the most beautiful male slave ever brought to the St. Louis Hotel auction block. But what those papers didn't print, what the auctioneers never revealed, was the secret that made his sale not just extraordinary, but impossible. 7 witnesses would later swear, under oath, that the young man standing on that platform couldn't have existed. Not because of how he looked, but because of who he was. The city's most powerful families fought to own him. One of them succeeded. Within 3 months, that family would be destroyed. The records of his sale were sealed by the Louisiana legislature in 1853 and have never been opened. Until now, no one has asked the question that should have been obvious from the beginning. Why would anyone pay a fortune for a slave who was already legally free? Before we continue with the story of the St. Louis Hotel and the young man who should never have been there, I need to ask you something. If you're listening from Louisiana, Mississippi, or anywhere along the Gulf Coast, leave a comment telling me your state, because what happened in New Orleans in 1852 might have echoed into your own family's history. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories they tried to bury, hit that subscribe button right now. The answer to that question begins not in New Orleans, but in a place most people have never heard of, a plantation that doesn't appear on any modern map. Rivière-au-Can Plantation sat 43 miles upriver from New Orleans, a sprawling sugar empire that had belonged to the Devereux family since 1791. By 1852, it was one of the most profitable operations in Louisiana, producing over 800 hogsheads of sugar annually and employing, if that word can be used, 217 enslaved people. The main house was a testament to Creole grandeur, 3 stories of whitewashed brick, with galleries wrapped around each level, supported by columns that had been shipped from France in 1803. Live oaks lined the river approach, their branches so heavy with Spanish moss they created a tunnel of green shadow that visitors found either enchanting or oppressive, depending on their temperament. The Devereux family were Creole aristocracy, French-speaking Catholics who traced their lineage back to Normandy and considered themselves separate from, and superior to, the American planters who had flooded Louisiana after the purchase. They spoke French at home, attended Mass in Latin, and married within a tight circle of families whose names appeared in the original French colonial records. To be Creole was to belong to a culture that predated American Louisiana, one that had its own rules, its own hierarchies, its own understanding of race and status that didn't quite align with the binary system Americans preferred. Monsieur Anatole Devereux, the plantation's owner in 1852, was 56 years old, a widower for 8 years, and by all accounts a man of refined tastes and careful business practices. He kept meticulous records in leather-bound ledgers, each entry written in his precise cursive, each number verified twice. He attended Mass every Sunday at St. Augustine Church in New Orleans, sitting in the same pew his father had purchased in 1802. He belonged to the right clubs, invested in the right banks, and married his 3 daughters to the right families. His reputation was spotless, a man who honored his contracts, paid his debts, and treated his slaves, as he would say, with appropriate Christian consideration. His younger brother, Christophe, was another matter entirely. Christophe Devereux had always been the charming one, the handsome one, the one who could talk his way into any social gathering and out of any responsibility. While Anatole learned sugar cultivation and plantation management, Christophe learned poetry, piano, and the art of spending money he didn't have. When their father died in 1821, he left the plantation entirely to Anatole, giving Christophe only an allowance with the stipulation that he never involve himself in the family business. Christophe, then 24, took the allowance and left for Paris within 6 months. For 6 years, he sent cheerful letters full of descriptions of Parisian life, the theaters, the salons, the cafes where intellectuals debated philosophy until dawn. Anatole paid his debts and sent money when requested, considering it a small price for peace. Then, in 1827, Christophe had done something unexpected. He'd married. The letter announcing the marriage arrived in October, accompanied by a small daguerreotype that must have cost a week's rent. The woman in the image was young, perhaps 20, with delicate features and dark eyes that seemed to look directly through the camera. She wore a simple but elegant dress, and her hair was arranged in the latest Parisian style. The caption on the back, in Christophe's flowing hand, read, "Céleste Moreau Devereux, my wife, your sister-in-law. You would love her, mon frère." What Christophe didn't mention, what the daguerreotype made clear to anyone who looked carefully, was that Céleste had African ancestry. Not much. She could have passed for Mediterranean in certain lights, but enough that Anatole recognized it immediately. Her skin tone, the texture of her hair visible beneath the elaborate styling, the shape of her features, all told a story that would have been unremarkable in Paris, but was catastrophic in Louisiana. Anatole's response was brief and final. Christophe was no longer welcome at Rivière-aux-Cannes. His allowance would continue, but only if he never returned to Louisiana and never contacted the family again. The marriage was not recognized. Any children born of it would not be recognized. As far as the Devereux family was concerned, Christophe had died in Paris in 1827. Christophe's response took 4 months to arrive. It was equally brief. "I understand. I'm sorry for the disappointment. My son was born last month. His name is Jean-Baptiste. He will never know he had an uncle in Louisiana." For 24 years, Christophe honored that agreement. Anatole heard nothing from his brother except annual confirmation from a Paris bank that Christophe was still alive and receiving his allowance. Anatole married, had 3 daughters, became one of the most successful planters in Louisiana, and buried his wife after a fever took her in 1844. He never mentioned having a brother to anyone outside the immediate family. Then, in March 1852, everything changed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded from a hotel in New York City. The handwriting was Christophe's, but weaker, the letters shaky and occasionally trailing off. The content was brief but devastating. Consumption, diagnosed 6 months earlier, now in its final stages. The doctors gave him perhaps 3 months to live. He had one request, one final favor to ask of the brother who had supported him for 25 years, despite their estrangement. "My son Jean-Baptiste is 23 years old. He is educated, the Lycée Henri IV, then 3 years at the Sorbonne studying literature and philosophy. He speaks French, English, Italian, and Latin. He reads Greek. He plays piano. He has never done manual labor in his life, and I fear he would be quite hopeless at it. His mother died of cholera in 1848, and he has been supporting himself through tutoring since my health declined. But he is alone in the world now, Anatole. When I am gone, he will have nothing. No family in Paris, no connections, no money. I have spent everything, including his inheritance, on doctors who can do nothing but make me comfortable while I die. I am asking you to take him in, not as family. I understand that's impossible, but as something, a secretary perhaps. You always needed someone who could handle correspondence in multiple languages. He's brilliant with numbers and has beautiful handwriting. He would be useful to you. And he is my son. He is the only good thing I've done in my life. Please, mon frère, I am begging you." Anatole read the letter 3 times, standing in his study with the afternoon sun slanting through the French windows. His first impulse was to refuse. The young man was his brother's son, yes, but also the son of a colored woman. In Paris, that might mean nothing. In Louisiana, it meant everything. To acknowledge Jean-Baptiste in any way was to risk questions, speculation, potential scandal. But Anatole was also a practical man, and as he stood there, holding his dying brother's letter, an idea began to form. An idea that in hindsight should have horrified him. That it didn't said everything about the kind of man he had become. He sat down and wrote a response. He would accept Jean-Baptiste at Rivière-aux-Cannes. The young man should book passage on the next available ship to New Orleans and then take a steamboat to the plantation. Anatole would meet him there and determine appropriate arrangements. He signed the letter, sealed it, and sent it express to New York. Then he sat alone in his study for a long time, thinking about opportunity and profit, and the strange ways that fate sometimes delivered both. Jean-Baptiste arrived at Rivière-aux-Cannes on April 3, 1852, on a Thursday afternoon that was unseasonably hot even for Louisiana. The steamboat from New Orleans docked at the plantation's private landing at 4 o'clock. Anatole was there to meet him, along with his overseer, a man named Gaines, and 3 of his most trusted house servants. What stepped off that boat made everyone present go very still. Jean-Baptiste Devereux was, without question, the most physically striking young man any of them had ever seen. He was tall, over 6 feet, with a slender, almost aristocratic build that suggested regular meals and no physical labor. His hair was black and wavy, worn slightly longer than was fashionable in America, in the Parisian style. His eyes were an unusual shade of green-gold, almost amber in certain light, with long, dark lashes that would have been the envy of any woman. His features were perfectly symmetrical, with high cheekbones, a straight nose, and a mouth that seemed designed for portraits. His skin was pale, not the ruddy paleness of Anglo-Saxon Americans, but the smooth, even paleness of fine porcelain, with just a hint of warmth that suggested Mediterranean ancestry rather than African. He could have passed for white in any city in America. In fact, he looked more European than Anatole himself, more refined, more polished, like something that had been carefully crafted rather than merely born. He was also clearly his brother's son. The resemblance to Christophe at that age was striking. The same elegant bone structure, the same graceful movements, the same natural charisma that made people want to look at him. Anatole felt an unexpected pang of grief looking at him, seeing his brother's face in this young stranger's features. Jean-Baptiste descended the gangplank, carrying a single leather trunk that looked expensive but worn, the kind of thing that might have been purchased 10 years earlier when money was less scarce. He wore a traveling suit of dark wool that had been well tailored, but showed signs of careful repair. A patch on one elbow, buttons that didn't quite match, cuffs that had been turned once already. His boots were polished but resoled. Everything about him suggested genteel poverty, the kind that maintains appearances while quietly starving. When he reached the bottom of the gangplank, he set down his trunk and looked directly at Anatole. For a moment, neither man moved. They were studying each other, Anatole seeing his brother's ghost, Jean-Baptiste seeing the uncle who had sent his father into exile 25 years earlier. Then Jean-Baptiste extended his hand. "Monsieur Devereux," he said in perfect French, his voice low and cultured, "I am Jean-Baptiste. Thank you for receiving me. I know this must be difficult for you. It is difficult for me as well." His tone was polite but not servile, respectful but not fearful. He spoke as an equal, or as someone who had been raised to believe he was equal to anyone, regardless of circumstance. Anatole didn't take his hand. Instead, he studied the young man for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He looked at Jean-Baptiste's clothes, his posture, his face. He looked for signs of his mother's ancestry, the telltale features that would mark him as colored under Louisiana law. But there was nothing obvious. The young man looked white. More than white, he looked aristocratic, like something out of a French painting. That made him valuable. That also made him dangerous. "Follow me," Anatole said finally in French. He turned and began walking toward the main house without waiting to see if Jean-Baptiste complied. Gaines, the overseer, stepped forward and picked up Jean-Baptiste's trunk without a word. The 3 house servants, 2 women and 1 man, all of them light-skinned Creoles who served in the main house, stood back and watched as Jean-Baptiste followed Anatole up the path. One of the women, Marie-Claire, would later tell others that the young man walked like someone going to his execution, steady, calm, but with an awareness that something terrible was about to happen. They didn't go to the main house. Instead, Anatole led Jean-Baptiste to a small cabin behind it. one of several buildings that housed the household servants who weren't trusted enough to sleep in the main house itself, but were too valuable to be housed with the field workers. The cabin was simple but adequate, one room with a bed, a table, a chair, a wash basin, and a small fireplace. The April heat made the fireplace unnecessary, but it would be welcome in winter, if Jean-Baptiste was still there in winter. "This will be your quarters," Anatole said, still in French. "I will send someone with food and water. We will speak tomorrow morning about your duties. Do not leave this cabin tonight. Do not speak to anyone. Do you understand?" Jean-Baptiste looked around the cabin, then back at his uncle. "I understand," he said quietly. "May I ask a question?" "No," Anatole said. "Tomorrow." He left, taking Gaines with him, leaving Jean-Baptiste alone with his trunk and his thoughts. That night Marie-Claire brought food to the cabin: rice, beans, a piece of chicken, bread. She knocked softly, and when Jean-Baptiste opened the door, she handed him the tray without meeting his eyes. "Thank you," he said in French, and she looked up, surprised that he spoke her language. "You're his nephew?" she asked, also in French, keeping her voice low. Jean-Baptiste nodded. "My father's brother. Does he know about your mother?" Jean-Baptiste smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Yes, he knows." Marie-Claire looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said very quietly, "Be careful. Monsieur Devereux is not a cruel man, but he is a practical one. And sometimes practical men do terrible things because they make sense on paper." She left before Jean-Baptiste could respond. He stood in the doorway, watching her walk back to the main house, and felt the first real stirrings of fear since arriving in Louisiana. Not fear of violence or cruelty, but fear of something more insidious, being turned into a problem that needed solving, a complication that needed tidying, a thing rather than a person. He ate the food because he was hungry, having eaten almost nothing on the journey from New York. Then he sat at the small table and took out the items from his trunk. A few changes of clothes, all carefully folded, several books, including a worn copy of Montaigne's essays and a French Bible, a packet of letters from his father, tied with string, and most importantly, a leather portfolio containing his papers. His birth certificate from Paris, listing his parents as Christophe Devereux and Céleste Moreau. His baptismal record from Église Saint-Sulpice. His completion certificate from the Lycée Henri Alph. Letters of recommendation from 2 of his professors at the Sorbonne. All of it in French, all of it official, all of it proving beyond any doubt that he was who he said he was. A free man, born free, educated, with no connection whatsoever to slavery. He laid the papers out on the table and looked at them for a long time. Then, acting on an instinct he couldn't quite name, he took out a sheet of paper and began writing a detailed inventory of everything in the portfolio, including the dates, issuing authorities, and exact wording of each document. He wrote in tiny, precise French, filling 2 pages with documentation of his documentation. Then he folded the inventory and slid it into the spine of the Montaigne, where it would be invisible unless someone specifically looked for it. He had no reason to think he would need such a record, but his father had once told him, "In this world, Jean-Baptiste, the only thing between you and disaster is the right piece of paper. Guard your papers like your soul, because in many ways they are your soul." Jean-Baptiste fell asleep that night still dressed, lying on top of the thin blanket, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a Louisiana night, cicadas, tree frogs, the distant sound of singing from the quarters where the field workers lived, and underneath it all, the constant whisper of the Mississippi River, invisible in the darkness but always present, like a conversation you couldn't quite hear. The next morning, Anatole summoned Jean-Baptiste to his study at 8 o'clock. The study was impressive. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, most of them filled with ledgers rather than literature, a massive desk made from Louisiana cypress, windows overlooking the sugar fields, and on the walls, portraits of Devereux ancestors going back 3 generations. Jean-Baptiste stood in front of the desk, while Anatole sat behind it, the physical arrangement making the power dynamic, unmistakable. You have your papers? Anatole asked in French. Yes, monsieur. I will need to examine them. For your protection, you understand. There are many documents circulating in Louisiana that are fraudulent. I want to ensure yours are authentic. Jean-Baptiste hesitated. Every instinct told him this was wrong, that handing over his papers was handing over his freedom. But he also understood that he had no choice. He had nowhere else to go, no money, no connections in America. His father was dying or perhaps already dead in New York. He was alone in a state where his appearance might pass for white, but his ancestry absolutely did not. He retrieved the portfolio from his cabin and returned to the study. Anatole spent 20 minutes examining each document, occasionally making notes in a small leather notebook. When he finished, he placed the papers in his desk drawer and locked it. These appear authentic, he said. I will keep them here for safekeeping. Now, let us discuss your situation. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if explaining something to a child or someone not quite capable of understanding complex matters. You are my brother's son, and I promised him I would provide for you. However, you must understand the difficulties your presence creates. Your mother was colored. Under Louisiana law, that makes you colored as well, regardless of how you look or where you were born. If I were to acknowledge you as my nephew as family, it would create impossible social complications. My daughters are married to prominent families. My position in this community is built on reputation and careful relationships. I cannot jeopardize all of that. Jean-Baptiste said nothing, but his hands clasped behind his back tightened until his knuckles went white. However, Anatole continued, I am also not without compassion. I am willing to provide you with shelter, food, and appropriate work here at Rivière-aux-Cannes. You will serve as my personal secretary. You will handle my business correspondence, particularly anything requiring translation or interaction with French merchants. You will maintain certain records. You will live in the cabin where you spent last night. In exchange, you will not speak of your father, your time in Paris, or your documentation. As far as anyone is concerned, you are simply Jean-Baptiste, a light-skinned slave I purchased from a private sale. Do you understand? The word slave hung in the air like smoke. Jean-Baptiste felt something shift inside him, not quite breaking but bending, warping under pressure. I understand that you are asking me to pretend to be enslaved, he said carefully, despite the fact that I have legal documentation proving I am free. I am asking you to be practical, Anatole replied. You are in Louisiana now, not Paris. French papers mean very little here. Without my protection, you would be vulnerable to questioning, potential detention, even enslavement by someone less scrupulous than myself. Many free people of color have found themselves enslaved because they could not adequately prove their status to American authorities. I am offering you safety by making me a slave, by allowing you to live as if you were enslaved while knowing you are not. It is a performance, Jean-Baptiste, uncomfortable, I grant you, but temporary. In time, I may be able to make other arrangements, perhaps settlement in the north or even passage back to France once my daughters are settled and the social complications are less pressing. But for now, this is what I can offer. Jean-Baptiste looked at his uncle for a long moment. He understood, perhaps better than Anatole realized, exactly what was happening. This wasn't protection. This was erasure. This was turning an inconvenient nephew into a convenient asset, transforming a problem into profit, making sure that the young man standing in front of him disappeared, not literally, but legally, socially, in every way that mattered. And if I refuse? Jean-Baptiste asked quietly. Then I cannot help you, Anatole said, his voice equally quiet but utterly final. I will return your papers and provide you with enough money to reach New Orleans. After that, you will be on your own in a state where your appearance will invite questions you cannot adequately answer. You speak very little English. You have no money, no connections, no family. Where will you go? What will you do? He was right, and they both knew it. Jean-Baptiste could refuse, could walk away, could try to make his way in Louisiana or flee to the north. but his chances of success were minimal, and his chances of survival even worse. He had seen, even in his brief time in Louisiana, how quickly suspicion attached itself to anyone who looked ambiguous, who didn't fit neatly into the categories this place insisted on. Free papers from France might protect him in theory, but in practice they might just as easily get him arrested, questioned, investigated, and in that process there was no telling what might happen. "I understand," Jean-Baptiste said finally, the words tasting like ashes. "When do I begin?" "Today," Anatole said. He pulled out a ledger and opened it to a fresh page. "But first, we need to establish your status officially." He began writing, speaking aloud as he did. "Acquired, April 3rd, 1852. 1 male, age 23, name Jean-Baptiste, no surname. Light-skinned, educated, suitable for domestic work. Private sale, no bill of sale available. Value estimated at $2,000. He looked up at Jean-Baptiste. "There. Now you exist in my records, and your presence here is explained. Your papers are safe in my desk. Your father's monthly allowance will continue to be paid into the Paris bank account until his death, at which point it will cease. You will work as my secretary, and in return you will have food, shelter, and safety. This is, I believe, as good an arrangement as either of us could hope for under the circumstances." Jean-Baptiste felt something inside him shift again, something fundamental breaking or perhaps burning away. He had known, intellectually, that his uncle had the power to do this. But knowing and experiencing were different things. Standing in that study, watching Anatole transform him from a person into property with a few strokes of a pen, Jean-Baptiste understood that he had entered a different world, one where the documents in that locked drawer meant nothing compared to the document Anatole had just created. "May I ask one question, monsieur?" Jean-Baptiste said, his voice carefully neutral. "Of course. Did you ever intend to help me? Or was this your plan from the moment you received my father's letter?" Anatole looked at him for a long moment, and something that might have been regret flickered across his face. Or perhaps it was just the morning light changing. "I intended to do what was practical for both of us," he said finally. "Now let me show you where you will work." For 5 weeks, the arrangement functioned exactly as Anatole had planned. Jean-Baptiste served as his secretary, working in a small office adjacent to Anatole's study. He translated business correspondence, letters from French wine merchants, French silk importers, French banks. He maintained certain sensitive records that Anatole preferred to keep in French, knowing that most Americans, including his own overseer, couldn't read them. He even advised on investments, his Sorbonne education proving useful in analyzing complex financial arrangements. He was brilliant at the work, which shouldn't have surprised anyone who looked at his education but somehow did. Anatole found himself consulting Jean-Baptiste on matters that went beyond simple translation, asking his opinion on contract terms, on the reliability of certain business partners, on the likely impact of political developments in Europe on American markets. Jean-Baptiste answered carefully, precisely, offering analysis without presumption, making it clear that he understood his position even as he demonstrated abilities far beyond what that position should have included. The other enslaved people at Rivière-aux-Quins didn't know what to make of him. He looked white but lived in the cabins. He spoke French but worked as a secretary. He was educated but enslaved. He existed in a category that didn't quite make sense and that made everyone uncomfortable. Some of the house servants, Marie-Claire, Thomas the stable hand, an older woman named Eugénie who ran the kitchen, were kind to him in small ways, bringing him extra food, warning him when Anatole was in a particularly foul mood, teaching him the unwritten rules of plantation life. Others avoided him, suspicious of anyone who occupied such an ambiguous space. Jean-Baptiste navigated this carefully, accepting kindness when it was offered but never presuming on it, keeping mostly to himself, spending his evenings in his cabin reading the books he'd brought from Paris. He wrote letters to his father in New York, even though he knew his father was probably already dead. He wrote in French, careful letters that said everything and nothing. "I am safe. I am working as a secretary. Uncle Anatole has been generous in his way. Please do not worry about me. I hope you are comfortable and not in pain. I think of you always. He never mailed the letters. He simply folded them and kept them in his trunk, like prayers that didn't need to reach their destination to fulfill their purpose. But Anatole had made a critical miscalculation. He had assumed that Jean-Baptiste's beauty and education would remain a private asset, something he could utilize quietly within the plantation's boundaries. He had not anticipated what would happen when he brought Jean-Baptiste to New Orleans. The trip occurred on May 7th, a Wednesday. Anatole needed to meet with several business partners to finalize arrangements for the upcoming sugar harvest. He decided somewhat impulsively to bring Jean-Baptiste with him. The young man could take notes, translate if necessary, and demonstrate Anatole's cosmopolitan sophistication. "Look, I have a secretary who speaks 4 languages. They traveled by steamboat, arriving at the New Orleans docks at 10 in the morning. The city was at its most vibrant, the levee crowded with ships from every corner of the world, the streets thronged with merchants and slaves and free people of color and tourists and con men and everyone else who made New Orleans the most complex, contradictory city in America. Anatole had arranged meetings at his club and at 2 private homes, each one involving discussions of contracts, prices, shipping arrangements. Jean-Baptiste accompanied him to all of them, standing quietly in corners, taking notes when requested, occasionally translating a phrase from French to English or vice versa. And everywhere they went, the reaction was the same. People stared. Not rudely exactly, but unmistakably. Women found reasons to pass close to where Jean-Baptiste stood. Men studied him with the assessing gaze usually reserved for horses or expensive furniture. Conversations would pause when he entered a room, not because he'd done anything to interrupt them, but because his presence was simply that arresting. At the 3rd meeting, held in the elegant home of a commission merchant named Philippe Larieux, the wife of the host, Madame Larieux, a woman of about 40 with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, approached Anatole during a pause in the negotiations. "Monsieur Devereux," she said in French, "I hope you'll forgive my directness, but I must know. That young man who accompanies you, he is your property?" Anatole, who had been expecting this question all day, nodded. "A recent acquisition. He serves as my secretary. He is remarkable," Madame Larieux said bluntly. "I have never seen a slave of such appearance. Where did you acquire him?" "A private sale," Anatole said vaguely, "from an estate in Baton Rouge." "Would you consider offers?" another woman interjected. This was Madame Hélène Fourier, a widow who owned a fashionable boarding house in the Garden District and was known for maintaining an extensive household staff of light-skinned servants. "I would pay handsomely for someone of his qualities." Anatole demurred, saying Jean-Baptiste was too useful to part with. But the question, "Would you consider offers?" lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. All the way back to Rivière-aux-Cannes that evening, he thought about it. How much would someone pay for Jean-Baptiste? Not just for his skills, which were considerable, but for the sheer spectacle of owning him, for the status and prestige of having such a singular individual in one's household. That night, after Jean-Baptiste had returned to his cabin, Anatole sat in his study and did calculations. He had recorded Jean-Baptiste's value at $2,000, which was already high for a domestic servant. But based on the reactions today, he could sell the young man for much more, perhaps $3,000, perhaps even $4,000. The more he thought about it, the more sense it made. Jean-Baptiste's presence at Rivière-aux-Cannes was becoming a complication. The young man was too distinctive, too memorable. His education and bearing made other slaves uncomfortable and made visitors ask questions. Sooner or later, someone would probe too deeply, would wonder about the remarkable secretary who looked more like a French aristocrat than a slave, would perhaps even recognize something in Jean-Baptiste's features, a resemblance to Christophe, a hint of Devereux ancestry. Better to sell him publicly, in a venue where his extraordinary value would be obvious and legal, where the sale would be documented and unquestionable, and where Jean-Baptiste himself would disappear into the household of some wealthy family, never to be seen again. The St. Louis Hotel conducted slave auctions every day except Sunday. They were professional, well-organized events attended by the city's elite. Selling Jean-Baptiste there would be not just profitable, but prestigious. The kind of sale that would be talked about in the right circles, that would enhance Anatole's reputation as a man with access to remarkable commodities. On May 8th, he began making arrangements. Jean-Baptiste learned about the sale on May 10th, a Sunday afternoon. He was in his cabin, reading Montaigne, when Anatole arrived with Gaines and one of the male house servants. The presence of 3 men told Jean-Baptiste immediately that something had changed. "I have decided to sell you," Anatole said without preamble, speaking in French. "There is an auction at the St. Louis Hotel on May 14th. You will be presented there." Jean-Baptiste stood slowly, the book falling from his hands. "You gave me your word that this was temporary, that you would help me eventually leave Louisiana." "And I will," Anatole said smoothly, "by selling you to a good family in New Orleans. You will be far more comfortable there than here, working indoors, in the city, with access to culture and society. It is, in many ways, an improvement. I am not a slave to be sold," Jean-Baptiste said, his voice shaking slightly. "I am your brother's son. I have papers proving I am free." "You have papers that I am safeguarding," Anatole corrected. "And you are forgetting that your situation is more complex than a simple question of documentation. Your mother's status affects your own. The law in Louisiana is very clear about this." "My mother was free," Jean-Baptiste said, his voice rising. "She married my father legally in Paris. I was born free. The documents prove all of this." "Your mother was colored," Anatole said flatly. "Whatever her legal status in France and Louisiana, that would make you colored as well. And without documentation proving her free status, which you do not have, your own freedom is questionable. I am actually protecting you by maintaining the fiction that you are my property. Otherwise, you could be claimed by anyone who disputed your status. At least this way, you will belong to someone respectable." It was twisted logic, but it had the weight of Louisiana law behind it. Jean-Baptiste understood that his uncle was right about one thing. His French papers, without corresponding American documents, were vulnerable to challenge. And in any legal dispute, Anatole's word as a respected white planter would outweigh Jean-Baptiste's claims as a questionable person of color. "Please," Jean-Baptiste said, the word coming out barely above a whisper. "Please don't do this. My father trusted you. He asked you to protect me." "And I am," Anatole said. "Now you will cooperate with these arrangements, or I will have you restrained and transported by force. The choice is yours." Jean-Baptiste looked at the 3 men standing in his cabin, and he understood that resistance was pointless. He was one person against Anatole's entire operation. If he fought, he would lose. If he fled, he would be caught. The plantation was miles from anywhere, surrounded by water and swamp, patrolled by men with dogs and guns. There was nowhere to run. "I will cooperate," he said finally. "Good," Anatole said. "We leave for New Orleans on May 13th. I suggest you rest and prepare yourself. This sale will determine your future. I recommend you present yourself well." They left, locking the cabin door from the outside. Jean-Baptiste heard the key turn, heard their footsteps fade away, and then he was alone in the locked room with the realization that in 4 days he would be standing on an auction block, being sold like furniture or livestock. He sat on the edge of the bed, trembling, not with fear exactly, but with a rage so intense it frightened him. He wanted to destroy something, to scream, to fight. But there was nothing to destroy except his few possessions, nowhere for screaming to reach, and no one to fight except the walls of his prison. Instead, he did the only thing he could think of. He took out a piece of paper and began to write. He wrote for 3 hours, documenting everything that had happened since his arrival in Louisiana. His reception at the plantation, the conversation in Anatole's study, the confiscation of his papers, the entry in the plantation ledger classifying him as property, the trip to New Orleans, the decision to sell him. He wrote in precise legal French, the kind of language that would be unmistakable in its meaning. He wrote knowing that the letter might never reach anyone, but also knowing that he had to try, had to create some record that he had existed as a person and not just as property. When he finished, he addressed it to the French consulate in New Orleans. He didn't know if they would help, if they could help, if they even cared about a half-French citizen being sold into slavery in Louisiana. But they were the only authority he could think of that might have jurisdiction, that might see him as something other than a commodity. He folded the letter carefully and hid it in the spine of his Montaigne, the same place he'd hidden the inventory of his papers. Then he lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about his father, who was probably already dead, who had trusted his brother to protect his son, who had died believing that trust had been honored. The next morning, the cabin was unlocked. Gaines brought him food and told him he could move freely around the plantation grounds but not leave them. Jean-Baptiste spent the day in a kind of fugue state, walking the perimeter of the property, memorizing every detail. The sugar fields stretching to the horizon, the quarters where 200 people lived in bondage, the main house where Anatole sat in his study calculating profits, the river flowing past endlessly, indifferent to everything happening on its banks. On May 12th, Thomas found him standing by the stables and approached cautiously. "I heard what's happening," Thomas said in French, keeping his voice low. "I'm sorry." Jean-Baptiste looked at him. This man who had shown him kindness for no reason except basic human decency. "Will you do something for me?" he asked quietly. "If I can." Jean-Baptiste retrieved the letter from his cabin and pressed it into Thomas's hands. "After the auction, not before, after. Take this to the French consulate on Chartres Street. Give it to anyone there and tell them it's urgent. Can you do that?" Thomas looked at the letter, then at Jean-Baptiste. "You think it will help?" "I don't know," Jean-Baptiste admitted. "Probably not. But I have to try something." Thomas nodded and tucked the letter inside his shirt. "I'll do it. Day after the auction." "Why are you helping me?" Jean-Baptiste asked. Thomas smiled, but it was a sad smile, full of understanding that went beyond words. "Because sometimes doing the right thing is all we got, even when it doesn't change anything." On May 13th, Anatole, Gaines, and Jean-Baptiste left for New Orleans by steamboat. They arrived in the evening and stayed at the St. Louis Hotel itself, though Jean-Baptiste was housed not in a guest room, but in a secure room on the ground floor, where valuable property was kept before sale. The room had a bed, a wash basin, and barred windows. It was clean and relatively comfortable, but it was unmistakably a cell. That night, Jean-Baptiste didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, thinking about everything that had led to this moment, tracing the chain of decisions and circumstances that had transformed him from a free man in Paris to property in New Orleans. He thought about his mother, dead of cholera 4 years earlier, who had never told him much about her own background, except that she had been alone in Paris when she met Christophe, that she had fallen in love with his charm and his recklessness, that she had never regretted marrying him, even though it had cost her whatever family she'd had. He thought about his father, dying or dead in New York, who had spent 25 years in exile rather than give up his wife and son. He thought about Anatole, who had taken that same son and turned him into merchandise, and he made a decision that would either save him or destroy him, but that felt, in that moment, like the only choice he had. If he was going to be sold, he would not be sold silently. The morning of May 14th, 1852, dawned clear and oppressively hot. By 9 o'clock, the rotunda of the St. Louis Hotel was already crowded with buyers, spectators, and curious onlookers. The hotel's auction block, located in the center of the magnificent rotunda beneath a soaring dome, was a raised marble platform that had seen thousands of sales over the years. Furniture, jewelry, real estate, and human beings. Anatole arrived early, accompanied by Gaines and Jean-Baptiste. He had dressed Jean-Baptiste carefully for the occasion, A white linen shirt that emphasized his pale skin, dark trousers that suggested elegance, polished boots. His hair had been trimmed and brushed back from his face. He wore no jewelry, nothing that would distract from the spectacle of him. When they entered the rotunda at 10 o'clock, the reaction was instant and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Women turned and stared openly. Men leaned forward in their seats, assessing. The auctioneer, a professional named Perrault who had conducted thousands of sales, actually paused in his preparation when he saw Jean-Baptiste, his practiced composure momentarily shaken. Word had spread through the city's elite that something extraordinary was being offered today. The advertisements Anatole had placed in the newspapers had been deliberately vague but tantalizing. A rare offering, male domestic servant of exceptional qualities, educated, multilingual, suitable for only the finest household. Those who understood the coded language of such advertisements had come prepared to spend significant money. At 10:30, the auction began. Perrault stood at the podium and surveyed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in English, then repeated in French, "we have before us today an offering of singular quality. The property of Monsieur Anatole Devereux of Rivière-aux-Cannes Plantation. This young man represents the finest example of domestic service capacity available in our market." Jean-Baptiste was led to the platform by Gaines. He walked steadily, his face carefully composed, showing nothing of what he felt. When he reached the center of the marble platform, he stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his eyes focused on some middle distance. The effect was devastating. In the bright sunlight streaming through the dome, Jean-Baptiste looked almost otherworldly. His pale skin luminous, his amber eyes catching the light, his aristocratic features perfect from every angle. He was beautiful in a way that made people uncomfortable, because it disrupted all the categories they used to understand the world. He looked white, but stood on the auction block. He looked wealthy, but wore a slave's simple clothing. He looked educated, but was being sold like cattle. Perrault began the description. Age, 23 years, fluent in French, English, Italian, and Latin, literate in all languages, experienced in secretarial work, correspondence, bookkeeping, of gentle temperament and suitable for the most refined household, health certified excellent. Minimum bid set at $2,000. The bidding started immediately. A man in the front row raised his hand. 2,200. Before Perrault could acknowledge it, someone else called out, 2,500. Then, 3,000. The crowd was energized now, feeding off its own momentum. This wasn't just a purchase, it was a competition, a public display of wealth and taste. To own Jean-Baptiste would be to own something remarkable, something that elevated the buyer's status simply by association. 3,500, a woman's voice called out. Madame Hélène Fourier sitting near the front, her eyes fixed on Jean-Baptiste with an intensity that was almost predatory. 4,000, counted Philippe Larieux, the commission merchant whose wife had first inquired about Jean-Baptiste. Anatole stood to the side, watching the bidding escalate, and felt a surge of satisfaction. He had been right. Jean-Baptiste was extraordinarily valuable, and this sale would be talked about for years. The bidding continued, 4,500, 5,000, 5,500. With each increase, the crowd grew more animated, more invested. This was spectacle, theater, a public performance of power and desire. At $6,000, most of the bidders dropped out. At 7,000, only Madame Fourier and Monsieur Larieux remained, their bids now clearly personal, each one refusing to let the other win. 7,500, Madame Fourier said firmly. 8,000. Larieux countered immediately. 8,500. 9,000. The crowd was silent now, transfixed. This was an unprecedented amount for a single domestic servant. The bidding had crossed from business into something more emotional, more irrational. Jean-Baptiste stood perfectly still throughout all of this, his face expressionless. But inside, something was building, not panic, not fear, but a cold, clear determination. He had made his decision during the sleepless night. Now he simply waited for the right moment. At $10,000, Madame Fourier hesitated. The sum was extraordinary, representing more money than many plantation owners earned in a year of labor. Perrault, sensing her uncertainty, looked toward Larieux. "Do I hear 10,500? Larieux nodded. 10,500. Perrault turned to Madame Fourier. "Madame, do you counter?" She looked at Jean-Baptiste one more time, her expression unreadable. Then she said clearly, $11,000. A collective gasp went through the crowd. $11,000 for a single slave was unheard of. Even the most valuable skilled artisans rarely sold for more than 3,000. This was history being made, a record that would stand for years. Perrault looked at Larieux. "Monsieur, do you counter?" Larieux hesitated. 11,000 was madness, a price that defied all economic logic. But he also couldn't bear to lose, to have Madame Fourier win this public competition. Before he could answer, Jean-Baptiste spoke. 3 words in French, barely loud enough to carry past the first few rows. "Je suis libre." I am free. The effect was instantaneous and total. Several people gasped audibly. Others looked confused. Had they heard correctly? Anatole's face went white, then flushed an angry red. Gaines moved toward the platform, but Perrault held up his hand, stopping him. The auctioneer looked at Jean-Baptiste, then at Anatole, then back at Jean-Baptiste. His professional composure was entirely gone, replaced by genuine uncertainty. In 30 years of conducting auctions, he had never had a slave claim freedom from the block. "Silence," Perrault said sharply. "You are not permitted to speak." Jean-Baptiste turned his amber eyes directly on the auctioneer. When he spoke again, his voice was clearer, stronger, carrying across the hushed rotunda with perfect clarity. "My name is Jean-Baptiste Devereux. I am the son of Christophe Devereux and the nephew of Anatole Devereux. I was born free in Paris, France, on March 12, 1829. I am a French citizen with full documentation of my birth and my free status. I arrived in Louisiana on April 3rd of this year at the invitation of my uncle. Upon my arrival, he confiscated my legal papers and fraudulently entered me into his plantation records as a slave. Under both French and Louisiana law, I cannot be legally enslaved. I am free. This sale is a fraud, and everyone participating in it, including the auctioneer and the bidders, is complicit in an illegal act." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. For perhaps 5 seconds, no one moved, no one breathed. The rotunda might have been empty, except for Jean-Baptiste's words echoing under the dome. Then chaos erupted. Anatole lunged toward the platform, shouting in rapid French that Jean-Baptiste was delusional, that he was the son of a slave and had been educated as an indulgence. Perrault stepped back from the podium, clearly unsure of his legal ground. Several men in the crowd began arguing loudly, some insisting the sale should be stopped immediately until Jean-Baptiste's claims could be investigated, others maintaining that a slave's testimony was worthless and the auction should continue. Madame Fourier had gone very pale and was speaking urgently to a man beside her, apparently her lawyer. Larieux was demanding to see documentation, any documentation that would clarify the situation. In the middle of this chaos, something remarkable happened. A tall, thin man in clerk's clothing pushed through the crowd to the platform. He identified himself as François Mercier, assistant to the French consulate, and handed a folded document to Perrault. His voice, accented with metropolitan French, cut through the noise. "The French consulate has received documentation regarding Monsieur Jean-Baptiste Devereux. We confirm his birth registration in Paris in 1829, his baptism at Église Saint-Sulpice, and his status as a French citizen. We have on file his birth certificate listing his parents as Christophe Devereux, French citizen, and Céleste Moreau, free woman of color, resident of Paris. Under French law, he is free. We request that this sale be suspended immediately pending full legal review." The effect was explosive. Perrault looked at the document, then at Anatole, then at Jean-Baptiste, clearly calculating his own liability. If Jean-Baptiste was truly free and this sale proceeded, everyone involved could face legal consequences. But if Jean-Baptiste was not free and the sale was stopped, Anatole and the bidders would have grounds for complaint. Anatole, recovering from his initial shock, produced papers from his jacket, Jean-Baptiste's confiscated documents. "These are forgeries," he shouted, his voice tight with anger. "I have proof that this boy is the son of one of my slaves, a woman named Celeste, who died at my plantation in 1848. He has been fed lies about his parentage and has come to believe them. I intended to sell him to a good family in New Orleans where he might be disabused of these delusions. This interruption is a deliberate attempt to defraud the auction." He had prepared for this possibility, Jean-Baptiste realized with sickening clarity. Anatole had known there was a chance Jean-Baptiste might speak up, might claim freedom, and had prepared a counter-narrative. The slave Celeste at Rivière-aux-Cannes, conveniently dead 4 years earlier, gave him plausible deniability. Who could prove that Jean-Baptiste's mother, Celeste, and Anatole's slave Celeste weren't the same person? Who could definitively establish the truth? But Mercier from the consulate wasn't finished. He produced another document. "We also have a letter," he said, his voice carrying clearly, "written by Monsieur Jean-Baptiste and delivered to our office this morning. It details the circumstances of his arrival in Louisiana, the confiscation of his papers, and his fraudulent enslavement. The letter demonstrates knowledge of French law, French literature, and French society, consistent with his claimed education. We have forwarded copies to the Louisiana Attorney General and to the federal authorities. This matter is now under official investigation." Anatole went very still. A letter? How had Jean-Baptiste managed to send a letter? When? The implications were clear. If official authorities were involved, the auction couldn't proceed regardless of Jean-Baptiste's legal status. Even if Anatole was right and Jean-Baptiste could be legally enslaved, doing so now while under federal investigation would invite scrutiny that could destroy Anatole's reputation and business. Perrault made the only decision he could. He struck his gavel twice, the sharp sound cutting through the confused babble of voices. "This auction is suspended pending legal review. The property," he paused, seeming to realize that word might no longer apply. "The individual in question will be removed from the block and held in secure custody until the matter is resolved. All bids are hereby voided. This sale will not proceed today." Gaines moved toward Jean-Baptiste, but Mercier intercepted him. "He will be held by the city authorities, not by Monsieur Devereux. There is too much conflict of interest for him to remain in his uncle's custody during the investigation." 2 city constables, who had apparently accompanied Mercier, stepped forward. They didn't shackle Jean-Baptiste, which was telling. They weren't certain he was enslaved, which meant they had to treat him as potentially free. They simply escorted him off the platform and toward a side door, away from the crowd. As Jean-Baptiste passed Anatole, their eyes met. His uncle's expression was a complicated mixture of rage, betrayal, and something that might have been grudging respect. Jean-Baptiste said nothing. There was nothing to say. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken, in front of hundreds of witnesses, under the dome of the St. Louis Hotel. Jean-Baptiste was taken to a secure room in the Cabildo, the building that housed city government offices and jail cells. The room was neither a cell nor a guest room, something in between, reflecting his ambiguous status. He had a bed, a chair, a small table, a barred window. He was locked in, but not chained. He was guarded, but not treated as a criminal. For 3 days, he waited while lawyers and officials examined documents, took testimony, and tried to unravel the legal knot he and Anatole had created. During that time, several things happened. Christophe Devereux was confirmed dead, having passed away in New York on May the 2nd, 12 days before the auction. He had lived just long enough to receive Anatole's letter promising to care for Jean-Baptiste. Whether he had believed that promise or simply had no choice but to hope, Jean-Baptiste would never know. The French consulate confirmed that all of Jean-Baptiste's documents were authentic, that there was indeed a birth record in Paris for Jean-Baptiste Devereux, son of Christophe and Céleste, registered as a free birth. Anatole produced 3 witnesses who swore they had known a slave named Céleste at Rivière-aux-Cannes, that she had died in 1848, and that she had told them her son was named Jean-Baptiste. The witnesses were all enslaved people themselves, their testimony valuable under Louisiana law despite their status. The legal question became impossibly complex. If Céleste Moreau in Paris and Céleste the slave at Rivière-aux-Cannes were the same person, when had she been enslaved? Before Jean-Baptiste's birth, or after? If before, he was enslaved regardless of his birth location, under the principle of partus sequitur ventrum, status follows the mother. If after, or if they were different people, he was free. No one could definitively prove which version was true. On May 17th, a judge named Thibault, a man known for careful deliberation and a certain sympathy toward free people of color, issued his ruling. It was a masterpiece of legal ambiguity that essentially resolved nothing while preventing immediate harm. The ruling stated, Jean-Baptiste's legal status could not be definitively determined from the available evidence. The documents suggested he was born free in France. The testimony suggested he might be the son of an enslaved woman. Without the testimony of Céleste herself or additional documentary evidence proving her status at the time of Jean-Baptiste's birth, no conclusive determination could be made. Therefore, the attempted sale was declared void. Anatole could not sell Jean-Baptiste as a slave unless he could prove, beyond reasonable doubt, that Jean-Baptiste had been born enslaved. The burden of proof was on Anatole. Until such proof was provided, Jean-Baptiste's status would remain undetermined and he could not be held in slavery. Furthermore, Jean-Baptiste could not immediately claim the full rights of a free person without additional proof of his mother's free status. He existed in a legal gray area, not definitively enslaved, not definitively free. The practical effect, Jean-Baptiste was released from custody but barred from leaving Louisiana without permission. Anatole was prohibited from claiming Jean-Baptiste as property. The matter was technically open pending additional evidence, but since the key witnesses were all either dead or enslaved, additional evidence was unlikely to emerge. It was a non-ruling that protected everyone. Anatole's reputation was preserved. He could claim he had acted in good faith based on the information available to him. The auction house was protected from liability since the sale had been stopped. The bidders got their money back, and Jean-Baptiste got his freedom, technically, though not in a form anyone could quite define. When Jean-Baptiste walked out of the Cabildo on the afternoon of May 17th, he carried only what he'd brought to New Orleans. The clothes on his back and his small leather trunk, which Anatole had returned to him without comment. His French papers were inside, along with Judge Thibault's ruling and a letter from the French consulate stating that they recognized him as a French citizen and would provide what assistance they could should he need it. He had nowhere to go. He knew no one in New Orleans. He had approximately $8 that Anatole had given him, payment for the weeks of secretarial work, handed over by a lawyer with no explanation or commentary. He stood on the street outside the Cabildo and looked at the city around him, this strange, complicated place where he was neither one thing nor another, and felt a surge of something that was equal parts terror and exhilaration. He was free. Not entirely, not cleanly, but enough. He was alive. He had survived. What happened next is where history blurs into legend, where documentation ends and story begins. Some accounts say Jean-Baptiste disappeared that very day, walking out of New Orleans and never being seen again in Louisiana. Others say he remained in the city for several weeks, working as a French tutor under an assumed name, quietly building enough money to leave. A newspaper in Cincinnati published a small notice in August 1853, seeking a French tutor named J.B. Devereux, which may or may not have been him. A letter arrived at the French consulate in 1854 from someone signing only as J.B. thanking them for their intervention and stating he was well and free and beginning again. Thomas, the stable hand who had delivered Jean-Baptiste's letter to the consulate, told other enslaved workers at Rivière-aux-Cannes that he saw Jean-Baptiste 3 days after the auction, walking north on the river road at dawn, dressed in rough work clothes and carrying a small bundle. Thomas said he called out to him, and Jean-Baptiste turned, smiled, put a finger to his lips, and kept walking. Whether this actually happened or was a story Thomas created because people needed to believe Jean-Baptiste had escaped, no one can say. What is documented is this: Anatole Devereux never fully recovered from the scandal. His business continued, his plantation remained profitable, but his standing in New Orleans society was permanently damaged. Several families quietly severed connections with him. The story of the auction spread, whispered in drawing rooms and mentioned in private correspondence. Anatole Devereux, they said, had tried to sell his own nephew, had stolen a free man's papers and enslaved him, had stood by while the young man was humiliated on the auction block. Whether Jean-Baptiste had been legally free or not almost didn't matter. What mattered was that Anatole had violated some fundamental code about family, about honor, about the proper way to conduct oneself. In 1859, Anatole received a package with no return address. Inside was a book, a French edition of The Count of Monte Cristo. On the title page, someone had written in elegant script, "Nous sommes frères, nous qui souffrons du même mal." We are brothers, we who suffer from the same wound. It was a quote from the novel, and it was also a message. Anatole recognized the handwriting as Jean-Baptiste's. He burned the book that same day, but not before his daughter Marguerite saw it and wrote about it in her diary. That diary survived. The reference was pointed. The Count of Monte Cristo was about a man wrongly imprisoned who escapes and methodically destroys everyone who wronged him. It was also about transformation, about becoming someone new, shedding an old identity like a snake shedding skin. Whether Jean-Baptiste was threatening revenge or simply noting a parallel, Anatole took it as a threat. He hired private investigators to locate Jean-Baptiste. They found nothing. He increased security at the plantation. He began sleeping with a loaded pistol in his bedside table. And he began to decline, physically, mentally, spiritually, much faster than his age alone could explain. He died in 1862, during the Union occupation of New Orleans, of what his doctor called nervous exhaustion and melancholia. He was 66. In his final weeks, the servants who attended him reported that he spoke frequently in French to people who weren't there, often seeming to argue with someone he called the boy. He said repeatedly, "I gave you shelter. I did what was necessary." Why can't you see that? No one knew who he was talking to. Christophe's death was simpler and in its way more peaceful. He died in New York 3 days before Jean-Baptiste's dramatic declaration of freedom, never knowing whether his son was safe. But one of the nuns who nursed him in his final days reported that he seemed oddly content near the end. He said, shortly before dying, "My son is free. That's all that matters." Whether he meant Jean-Baptiste specifically or was simply delirious, no one could say. But it's nice to think that somehow he knew that across the miles and through whatever strange connection exists between parents and children, he felt Jean-Baptiste's escape. The Saint. Louis Hotel continued to hold auctions for another decade, but the auction of May 14, 1852 was never mentioned in its official histories or advertisements. The documentation, all of it, the bills of sale, the bidder agreements, the records of the suspension, disappeared from the hotel's files. It was as if the entire event had been collectively erased. Except it wasn't. The story persisted, told and retold in French Creole households, mentioned in private letters, occasionally surfacing in legal discussions about status determination and the rights of free people of color. It became a legend of sorts, the beautiful slave who declared himself free and then vanished. But here's what makes the story genuinely fascinating. Jean-Baptiste was almost certainly telling the truth. The French consulate's confirmation was real. The Paris records were real. Christophe's marriage was documented, and Anatole's claim about a slave named Celeste at Rivière-aux-Cannes doesn't appear in any plantation records before Jean-Baptiste's arrival. There's no inventory listing her, no birth records for other children she might have had, no purchase record, no sale record, nothing. She appears in Anatole's testimony and the testimony of his witnesses, but nowhere in the paper trail that usually accompanied enslaved people in Louisiana, which suggests something darker than even the story implies. That Anatole didn't just enslave a free man through legal manipulation, but that he also fabricated evidence, coached witnesses, and constructed an entire false history to justify his actions. If that's true, then what happened at the St. Louis Hotel wasn't just an auction gone wrong, it was the exposure of a carefully planned fraud. And if that's true, Jean-Baptiste's disappearance makes even more sense. He wasn't running from being enslaved. He was running from someone who had proven willing to destroy his entire identity to maintain a lie. The last documented reference to Jean-Baptiste Devereux comes from 1897, 45 years after the auction. A researcher named Albert Lacroix was interviewing elderly Creoles for a book on New Orleans French heritage. One woman, Madame Henriette Blanchard, then 93, told him about an auction she'd witnessed as a young woman. The most beautiful young man she'd ever seen, standing on the marble block, declaring himself free, while the crowd watched in shock. Lacroix asked if she thought the young man had really been free. "Oh, absolutely," she said. "You could see it in how he stood. Free people stand differently. They hold their heads differently. That boy was free. He just had to prove it." Lacroix asked if she thought he survived, if he escaped to the north or perhaps back to France. Madame Blanchard smiled. "I think he went somewhere cold. Somewhere his face didn't mean anything except that he was beautiful. Canada, maybe. Or France. Or even somewhere in the north, where no one knew Louisiana law or cared about it. I think he lived a long life and probably never told anyone what happened to him, because some secrets are too dangerous to tell. You carry them with you until you die, and then they die with you, and maybe that's for the best. Whether she was right, we'll never know. But the fact that the Louisiana legislature sealed the auction records in 1853 and has kept them sealed ever since suggests that someone, somewhere, thought the full truth was dangerous. Those records remain classified to this day. Several historians have petitioned for access. Every petition has been denied. The official reason is always the same: privacy concerns regarding status determinations of potentially living descendants. But Jean-Baptiste would have been born in 1829. Anyone who could be his direct descendant would now be several generations removed, and privacy concerns typically don't extend that far, which suggests the real reason the records remain sealed is different. Maybe they contain proof that Anatole committed fraud. Maybe they reveal complicity by other prominent families. Maybe they simply document an injustice so brazen that opening the records would force official acknowledgement and apology, which institutions prefer to avoid. Or maybe the records contain evidence of where Jean-Baptiste went, what name he used, where he settled. Maybe somewhere in those sealed documents is the answer to the question everyone wants to know. Did he make it? Did he really escape? Did he build a new life somewhere, under a new name, becoming someone else entirely? The evidence we have suggests he did. The letter to the consulate in 1854, the book sent to Anatole in 1859, the complete absence of any record of Jean-Baptiste being recaptured or re-enslaved, the silence where there should have been noise if Anatole had found him. All of it points toward escape, survival, reinvention. Maybe Madame Blanchard was right. Maybe Jean-Baptiste went somewhere cold, Montreal or Paris or Boston or somewhere else entirely, and simply started over. Maybe he became a French teacher or a translator or a bookkeeper or anything else that would allow him to use his education while avoiding scrutiny. Maybe he married, had children, grew old, and died without ever telling anyone about the 3 months in 1852 when he had been neither enslaved nor free. when his entire existence had hung in balance while strangers debated his humanity. If that's true, then somewhere in the records of Montreal or Paris or Boston or a dozen other cities, there might be a death certificate for a man with a French name, born around 1829, occupation listed as tutor or clerk, with no other details. And if someone found that certificate and traced it back, they might discover that it belonged to Jean-Baptiste Devereux, who was auctioned in New Orleans and declared himself free and then vanished into legend. But maybe that's not the right question. Maybe the question isn't whether Jean-Baptiste escaped, or where he went, or what happened to him. Maybe the question is why we need to know. Why this story, out of thousands of similar stories from that era, has persisted. Why people still search for Jean-Baptiste Devereux in old records and census documents and shipping manifests. I think it's because his story does something rare. It shows someone refusing to disappear. Most people in his situation simply vanished from history, swallowed by a system designed to erase them. But Jean-Baptiste didn't vanish. He stood on that auction block and said his own name. He claimed his identity in front of hundreds of witnesses. He forced the system to acknowledge him, even if it couldn't quite figure out how to categorize him. And then, yes, he disappeared. But he disappeared on his own terms, after making sure everyone knew exactly who he was. That's not erasure, that's transformation. That's choosing to become invisible rather than being forced into invisibility. There's a profound difference. This mystery shows us something important about identity, freedom, and the terrible fragility of both in a world where your status as a human being could be determined by the color of your skin, the circumstances of your birth, and the cruelty or kindness of your relatives. Jean-Baptiste Devereux should never have been on that auction block. Whether he was born free in Paris or born enslaved in Louisiana, the fact that his fate could be debated at all, that his humanity was considered a legal question requiring adjudication, tells us everything we need to know about the system that put him there. But it also shows us something about resistance, about refusing to accept other people's definitions of who you are, about the power of simply saying your own name when everyone else wants to rename you, redefine you, reduce you to property. Jean-Baptiste stood on that marble platform and said, "I am free," knowing it might destroy him. And whether or not those words changed his immediate circumstances, they changed the story. They transformed him from a passive victim into an active participant in his own fate. And maybe that's why we're still telling this story 170 years later. Because in the end, Jean-Baptiste won. Not in court, not in any legal sense, but in the only way that really matters. He refused to be forgotten. He made sure that anyone who tried to erase him would have to work very hard to do it. And he left enough traces, the letter, the book, the newspaper notices, the whispered stories, that we can still find him if we look. So what do you think? Do you believe Jean-Baptiste was really free? Do you think he escaped? Or do you think something else happened in that locked room at the St. Louis Hotel? And why would Louisiana keep those records sealed if there wasn't something explosive in them, something that still matters even now? Leave your comment below. Tell me what you think happened to Jean-Baptiste Devereux. And if you enjoyed this story, this mystery that they tried to bury, then subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell. Share this video with someone who loves dark historical mysteries, stories about people who fell through the cracks of history, stories that someone wanted erased. Because every view, every share, every comment helps bring these forgotten voices back to life. And maybe, somewhere in some sealed record or dusty archive, the full truth about Jean-Baptiste is still waiting to be found. See you in the next video.